Why are you wearing that uniform here?
I'm active duty. I'm traveling on orders.
That doesn't answer the question.
It does. I can show you my ID.
Hold on.
This is my military identification.
That doesn't mean anything in this space.
It verifies who I am.
We'll decide that.
So what's the issue?
Impersonation happens more than you think.
Then run it.
Who did you say you report?
The interaction was taking place inside a controlled area connected to a major U.S. airport, where local police, transportation authorities, and federal agencies operate alongside one another. It was a space designed for routine movement, not confrontation. Travelers passed through regularly, some in civilian clothes, others in uniforms tied to government work. Nothing about the setting was unusual. The man in dress blues was an active-duty Navy SEAL assigned to a unit that required frequent travel. His orders placed him in transit that morning, moving between official locations using approved routes. Wearing his uniform was permitted under military regulations, especially during official movement. His presence did not violate airport policy, local law, or federal guidelines. The officer who stopped him was a municipal police officer assigned to airport duty. His role involved enforcing local statutes, responding to disturbances, and addressing security concerns referred by airport staff. Officers in that assignment were given discretion to question behavior that appeared inconsistent with the environment. That discretion, however, relied heavily on individual judgment. In this case, the judgment was shaped by context rather than evidence. A full-dress uniform outside a ceremonial setting can raise questions for officers trained to look for impersonation or misuse of authority symbols. Cases involving fake uniforms were not unheard of, and departments routinely briefed officers to be cautious. The policy emphasized verification, not assumption. What complicated the exchange was jurisdiction. Military identification is federally issued and verifiable through established systems, but local officers do not always have direct access to those databases. Standard procedure requires contacting a supervisor or a liaison when military credentials are presented. That step had not yet occurred. Instead, the interaction remained fixed at the level of the initial stop. The officer focused on whether the uniform belonged in that space, rather than whether the individual was authorized to wear it. The SEAL's explanations were treated as claims rather than information. His ID was viewed as something to be questioned later, not resolved immediately. There was no hostility in the officer's voice and no raised volume. The tone stayed procedural. That calmness made the situation seem ordinary on the surface, even as it drifted away from standard protocol. The longer it continued, the harder it became for either side to reset without escalation. Unbeknownst to both men, the verification process had already begun in the background. The moment the officer requested a records check tied to the identification, the inquiry moved beyond the airport. Military credentials trigger confirmation steps that pass through multiple systems, some automated, some manual. Those systems do not pause for discretion. This was the point where the misunderstanding stopped being local. What appeared to be a routine question about a uniform was now logged, time-stamped, and routed through channels designed to protect national security personnel. No one at the scene acknowledged that shift yet. The conversation continued as if nothing had changed. The quiet escalation was not emotional, it was administrative. And once it started, it could not be undone. Before the airport assignment, his career had followed a predictable path defined by structure and evaluation. He had entered the Navy through a standard enlistment process, passed screening, and moved into special operations after meeting physical and cognitive benchmarks required for the role. Advancement came through documented performance, not visibility. Within his unit, reputation was built quietly through reliability and compliance with procedure. He had served multiple deployments under different commands, each logged through official channels. His record showed no disciplinary actions, no reprimands, and no unresolved complaints. Performance reviews described him as methodical and calm under pressure. He was not known for confrontation, and he did not seek attention outside operational requirements. When traveling on orders, he followed guidance closely, including when and where to wear his uniform. Dress blues were not worn casually. They were issued for formal duty, ceremonies, or authorized transit connected to official movement. On that day, His orders required travel between assignments that involved command-level briefings. Wearing the uniform was consistent with those instructions. It reduced friction with military checkpoints and signaled official status in controlled environments. He had moved through airports before without incident. In most cases, the uniform prompted brief nods or routine acknowledgments from security staff. Occasionally, someone would ask a clarifying question, which he answered without difficulty. Verification, when required, was usually handled quickly by supervisors familiar with military credentials. There had been one earlier incident, years prior, that stood out only because it had required explanation. At a civilian facility unrelated to the military, a staff member questioned whether he was authorized to enter a restricted area while in uniform. He had presented identification, a supervisor was called, and the matter was resolved in minutes. No report was filed. No follow-up occurred. It was treated as a misunderstanding, not misconduct. That experience shaped how he approached similar situations. He learned that clarity and patience were usually sufficient. Escalation was avoided unless directed. He did not interpret questions as personal challenges. To him, they were procedural steps within systems that generally corrected themselves. Within his unit, discretion was expected. Members were instructed to minimize attention while traveling and to defer to civilian authorities when stopped, even if the stop seemed unnecessary. The assumption was that compliance reduced risk and delay. Arguing jurisdiction on the spot was discouraged. His demeanor reflected that training. During the airport stop, he remained composed, answered questions directly, and offered documentation when requested. He did not raise his voice or question the officer's authority. His expectation was that the situation would follow the same pattern as previous encounters. Brief review, confirmation, release. What he did not account for was how unfamiliarity can alter routine interactions. Not all officers encounter military personnel regularly, and not all departments handle those encounters the same way. In environments where impersonation cases are emphasized during briefings, suspicion can override process. From his perspective, the stop was an interruption, not a threat. He was aware of his schedule and the consequences of delay, but he trusted that the system would resolve the issue once verification occurred. He did not know how far that verification would travel or who would see it. At that moment, his focus remained narrow. He was thinking about the next checkpoint, the time on his orders, and whether he needed to notify his command about a delay. He had no indication that the interaction was already being recorded as more than a routine inquiry. Nothing in his career had prepared him for the scale of what would follow. Based on past experience, there was no reason to expect it. The incident began with a simple request to stop. The officer positioned himself slightly to the side, leaving space between them. People moved past in both directions, pulling luggage, speaking quietly, focused on their own schedules. The background noise was consistent, rolling wheels, overhead announcements, short conversations. No one stopped to watch. The officer asked where he was headed. The SEAL answered with a destination tied to his orders. The response was specific but restrained. The officer asked again, phrasing the question differently, as if looking for a mismatch. The answer remained the same. There was no visible tension, only repetition. When asked for identification, the SEAL reached into his jacket pocket slowly and produced his military ID. The motion was deliberate, practiced. He held the card out without stepping forward. The officer took it, glanced at it briefly, and did not comment. Instead, he asked why someone would be wearing dress blues in that part of the airport. The question reframed the interaction. It was no longer about identity, but about justification. The SEAL explained that he was traveling on orders and that the uniform was authorized. His explanation was short, factual, and aligned with military guidance. The officer nodded once, not in agreement, but to signal he had heard the words. A pause followed. The officer looked around, then back at the uniform. He asked whether the SEAL had any additional documentation. The request was not accusatory, but it implied the ID alone was insufficient. The SEAL replied that his orders were electronic and accessible if needed. He did not reach for his phone unless instructed. That hesitation became the misread gesture. The officer interpreted the pause as reluctance. He stepped slightly closer and asked the SEAL to remain where he was. The instruction was calm, but it changed the dynamic. Movement stopped. The exchange shifted from inquiry to control. The officer returned the ID but kept his notepad out. He asked for the SEAL's unit. The answer was given. The officer asked again, this time spelling it out as he wrote, confirming details that had already been provided. Each repetition added time without adding clarity. The SEAL adjusted his stance, shifting his weight, careful not to appear impatient. He was aware of the uniform's visibility and the effect it could have in public spaces. He kept his hands visible and his responses neutral. His training emphasized reducing ambiguity, not challenging authority. Another officer passed by, glanced briefly, and continued walking. No assistance was requested. The stop remained contained. The officer on duty spoke into his radio quietly, requesting a routine check. The phrasing did not indicate urgency. It sounded procedural. As minutes passed, the questions circled back. Why was he there? Why that uniform? Why now? Each answer matched the previous one. The SEAL's voice did not change, but the repetition signaled that resolution was not coming quickly. For the first time, the SEAL considered the possibility of delay affecting his orders. He calculated how long he could remain before needing to notify his command. He did not express that concern aloud. The situation still appeared manageable. The officer looked down at his notepad, then at the uniform again. The check had been submitted. There was nothing to do but wait. The interaction settled into a quiet standstill, shaped less by conflict than by uncertainty. At that moment, the incident was still small. It occupied only a few feet of airport floor and the attention of two people. Nothing about it suggested how far it would extend once the verification returned. The officer returned to the same questions, adjusting wording but not direction. He asked again whether the uniform was official issue. The SEAL answered that it was. He was asked how long he had been in service. He provided the number. None of the responses appeared to satisfy whatever inconsistency the officer believed existed. The officer mentioned impersonation cases in general terms. He said they were more common than people realized. The statement was not directed as an accusation, but it framed the exchange around suspicion rather than verification. The SEAL responded that he understood and repeated that his identification could be confirmed through standard channels. A nearby airport employee slowed briefly while passing, noticed the uniform, then continued walking. No one stopped. No one intervened. The lack of attention kept the interaction subdued, but it also meant there was no external pressure to resolve it quickly. The officer asked the SEAL to confirm his reporting command. When the answer came, the officer paused, then asked him to repeat it. The repetition felt less like clarification and more like disbelief. The SEAL complied without comment. He did not correct tone or challenge the implication. At one point, the officer stated that the uniform didn't make sense in that location. The SEAL replied that he was authorized to be there and that his orders allowed transit in uniform. The response was calm, but it was the first time his patience was tested. He briefly considered asking for a supervisor, then decided against it, expecting the records check to resolve the matter. The subtle humiliation came through dismissal. Each explanation was met with silence or a redirection to another question. The ID, once returned, was no longer acknowledged. The officer spoke as if the earlier proof had not been presented. The SEAL noticed this shift but chose not to point it out. Another officer approached within hearing distance, listened for a moment, and then deferred without engaging. The primary officer remained in control of the stop. His posture stayed relaxed, but his language closed off alternatives. The exchange narrowed instead of moving forward. There was a brief moment when the SEAL felt the risk of escalation, not physical, but procedural. He understood that prolonged stops could trigger additional reporting requirements. He measured his responses carefully, aware that tone could be misinterpreted. He kept his answers short and factual. The officer asked him to wait again. The radio remained quiet. The SEAL stood still, hands visible, eyes forward. The interaction had lost its initial neutrality. It was no longer a question of whether he was authorized, but whether the officer believed him. Nothing dramatic occurred. No voices were raised. No commands were shouted, but the imbalance was clear. One person's authority depended on assumption, the other's depended on documentation that had not been accepted. By the time the radio finally responded, the delay had already taken its effect. The stop had moved beyond clarification into record. The SEAL did not yet know what information was being relayed back, only that it was taking longer than expected. That was when the tone shifted again, not because of anything said on the scene, but because of what was being confirmed elsewhere. The response came through the radio without urgency, but the officer's posture changed as he listened. He asked for the information to be repeated, then turned slightly away to acknowledge it. The exchange was brief and quiet. No details were shared aloud. Moments later, a supervising officer approached from the edge of the corridor. He did not rush. His presence was not announced. He stood close enough to hear the end of the radio traffic, then asked a single clarifying question. The primary officer answered in a low voice. The supervisor looked at the SEAL's uniform, then asked for identification again. The SEAL handed over his military ID without comment. This time, the card was examined carefully. The supervisor did not question why the uniform was being worn. Instead, he focused on the name, the number, and the issuing authority. He stepped aside and made a call that did not go through the local dispatch channel. The tone of the conversation was formal and brief. He confirmed details, repeated them, and listened without interrupting. When the call ended, he remained still for several seconds. The shift was subtle. The supervisor's questions stopped. He handed the ID back with both hands. His voice was steady when he spoke, but the wording changed. He referred to the SEAL by rank. It was the first time rank had been acknowledged. The primary officer remained silent. He looked down at his notepad, then folded it closed. The confidence he had displayed earlier was replaced by hesitation. He asked the supervisor if there was anything further required. The question suggested retreat rather than control. The supervisor replied that the verification had been completed. He did not explain what had been confirmed or through which channels. He simply stated that the SEAL was authorized to proceed. There was no announcement, no apology delivered on the spot. The atmosphere adjusted without comment. The supervisor stepped back, creating space. The primary officer took a step to the side. The path ahead cleared naturally as travelers continued moving around them. Before the SEAL could leave, the supervisor asked for his order's number. The request was administrative. The SEAL provided it. The supervisor noted it without reaction. That information, like the earlier verification, was being documented. The primary officer asked one final question, directed at the supervisor rather than the SEAL. It was about next steps. The supervisor answered quietly, using language that suggested reporting obligations beyond the airport. The SEAL was told he was free to go. The words were plain. There was no acknowledgement of delay. He nodded once and adjusted his uniform. He did not ask for names or badge numbers. His training emphasized departure over discussion. As he walked away, the supervisor remained standing with the primary officer. Their conversation did not follow. Whatever had been confirmed had shifted authority away from the scene. The correction was complete, but it did not feel like closure. The incident had been resolved procedurally, yet its consequences were already forming outside the airport, within systems that recorded deviations as seriously as threats. Following the incident, reports were submitted through both airport and military channels. Internal Affairs within the Municipal Police Department reviewed the officer's conduct, noting procedural lapses and repeated dismissal of verifiable identification. The review documented every step of the stop, the questions asked, and the timing of the supervisor's intervention. The SEAL's information and verification process were included in the record, establishing the factual timeline. The primary officer was placed on administrative leave pending the outcome of the investigation. This suspension was standard protocol when procedural errors intersected with federal personnel. The leave was not framed as disciplinary action at that point. It allowed investigators to examine the incident without interference or influence from active duty on the scene. Concurrently, federal authorities examined the interaction for potential implications involving military personnel security. Any situation where identification is challenged and verification delayed triggers cross-agency review. The SEAL's status amplified attention, as procedural delays could have affected operational schedules or classified assignments. Analysts determined that while no threat was present, the handling was inconsistent with policy. The media coverage that followed was factual, emphasizing verification procedures and the procedural misstep by the officer. Headlines noted the delay and the eventual resolution, but avoided speculation or dramatization. The narrative focused on what happened, not why individuals may have felt tension or embarrassment. Statements from the police department highlighted ongoing training and review procedures. Policy considerations were revisited internally. Procedures for stops involving uniformed federal personnel were clarified, with emphasis on immediate verification and supervisor involvement. Training protocols were adjusted to reduce reliance on assumption or visual cues alone. Systems were updated to ensure that identification verification triggers more rapid cross-checks, minimizing prolonged stops. Legal consultation confirmed that while no laws were violated, procedural errors could have led to administrative consequences. Guidelines reinforced the expectation that officers must respect verified credentials, particularly when federal personnel are involved. Future stops in similar contexts were to follow defined escalation paths rather than discretionary judgment alone. For the SEAL, the event was logged internally as a minor operational disruption. Orders and schedules were slightly adjusted, but there were no operational failures. The documentation emphasized adherence to protocol by the officer and the importance of timely verification for security and efficiency. The primary officer remained under review until the investigation concluded. Findings determined that repeated dismissal of valid identification constituted a failure to follow protocol. Administrative action, additional training, and reassignment were recommended. No criminal charges were filed, as intent to harm or commit misconduct was not established. The outcome reinforced institutional checks and clarified procedural responsibilities. By the end of the review period, all parties involved returned to their respective duties with procedural changes in place. The event remained a documented case study for airport operations and interagency cooperation, serving as a reference for how misinterpretation and assumption can intersect with federal authority without escalating into overt conflict. The incident highlights how assumptions can affect interactions with authority figures, particularly when uniformed personnel are involved. In this case, the officer acted based on appearance and context rather than verified information. The SEAL's calm, factual responses were insufficient to override the initial judgment until confirmation through formal channels occurred. The delay was procedural, not personal, but it underscores the risks inherent when assumptions guide decisions. Bias in this context was subtle. The officer relied on prior training and briefings that emphasized impersonation risks, a legitimate concern in airports. However, reliance on visual cues or preconceived ideas about uniforms can lead to misjudgment. The SEAL's race, though not mentioned by anyone, intersected with those assumptions to amplify uncertainty. Systems designed to correct such errors exist, but only if processes are followed promptly. This situation demonstrates that procedural structures can both contain and escalate misunderstandings. Had the SEAL responded differently, arguing or raising his voice, the outcome might have appeared confrontational. Conversely, strict adherence to policy by the officer could have resolved the issue quickly. Neither side acted outside rules, yet the interaction became prolonged due to reliance on judgment over verification. Lessons can be drawn about the interaction of human perception, institutional training, and organizational oversight. Clear verification procedures, immediate supervisor involvement, and reliance on documented authority reduce the potential for misinterpretation. Systems function best when assumptions are minimized and evidence-based checks are prioritized. The SEAL's experience also highlights the importance of maintaining composure and following protocol. Compliance and factual communication allowed the verification process to succeed. While the situation could have been perceived as humiliating or frustrating, the resolution demonstrates how structured procedures correct errors quietly, without spectacle. In sum, this event shows that small, controlled misunderstandings can escalate subtly when judgment is used instead of verification. Institutional safeguards and awareness of implicit bias are crucial to prevent procedural errors from affecting careers or operational tasks. Calm, factual handling on both sides ultimately allowed the system to correct itself before any further consequence arose. We've followed the events closely, from the initial stop to the verification and resolution. Now we want to hear from you. Have you ever experienced a situation where assumptions about authority, uniforms, or identification caused delays or misunderstandings? How was it handled? Share your thoughts and personal experiences in the comments below. Your perspective helps create a conversation around procedural fairness and the impact of assumptions in real-world settings. If you found this case study insightful, consider following the channel for more documented real-world stories. Each video examines incidents with a focus on facts, sequence, and outcomes rather than exaggeration or dramatization. Staying connected ensures you can see how similar situations unfold and what lessons are drawn from them. We aim to provide a space for calm discussion, reflection, and understanding of how systems interact with people in daily life. Subscribing and joining the conversation allows you to stay informed on procedural case studies and learn from examples without sensationalism.